Do you have a favourite film? Do you have a favourite film? It's quite a hard one, isn't it, to think about off the top of your head, but I've spent a little bit of time thinking about it, and I reckon that my favourite film of all time is probably LA Confidential. LA Confidential. Okay, it must be good, because it's one of those films that you will never find second-hand in a charity shop. And I've looked. Got a fantastic cast, if you've seen it. It's got Kevin Spacey, Russell Crowe, and a man called Guy Pearce. Now, those of us of a certain age will remember that Guy Pearce made his name as Mike in Neighbours. Yeah, he did. But don't let that put you off. It's a story about corruption in the Los Angeles Police Department in the 1950s. And there's a big incident in a bar called the Night Owl. Okay? And because of his involvement in sorting this out, Guy Pearce becomes a hero in the LAPD. He is the rising star of Los Angeles Police Department. But then he begins to realise that what happened that night wasn't all that it seems. In fact, it was completely rotten. And so he tells one of the other officers, "Hey, look at me, look at me. Don't look at Evie, look at me. Jane, look at me. Come on." He says to one of these other officers, "Listen, there's something wrong with this." And the officer says, "Do you want to reopen the Night Owl case? But it made you. And you're going to bring the whole thing down." And Guy Pearce says, "Yeah, I'm going to bring the whole stinking lot down." And as we come to Titus this morning, we're going to see that there might be a bit of clearing away to be done in our lives, yours and mine. We're looking at this little letter which the Apostle Paul wrote to Titus, a much younger man, and he wrote it in about the year 60 AD, and they were living on Crete, a beautiful island which had a terrible reputation. Second reading, verse 12, even one of their own people, a native of Crete, said, "You know what, Cretans are liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons." But the gospel of Jesus Christ arrives with power. And churches are started, and so Paul writes to Titus to remind him that this gospel of grace shows itself in godly living. Remember, that's what we looked at last week. Godly living, which is completely different and which is counter-cultural. And you could sum it up with this heading. Fantastic, there we go. We looked at that last week, didn't we? What's the mission? It's truth leading to godliness. And how do you pass this mission on? Well, Paul says you need to find people with the right gifts and the right skills. No, he doesn't, does he? He does not say that, does he? Do you remember? He does not say that. He said, don't look for skills and gifts. That's what the world looks for. But you will not have a transforming gospel ministry and mission if you look for gifts and skills. Paul says the job spec for church leaders is all about godly character. Godly character. So if we could have the next slide, Jeff, that would be great. You could call it grace before gifts. We started to think about it last week, didn't we? We said a church leader must be blameless at home. Not perfect, not without fault, but he should love his wife and be faithful to her, and he should know how to look after his family. We thought about all that last week. A church leader needs to be blameless in character. Not perfect, not without fault. But verse 7, not overbearing. In other words, not a bully. Not quick-tempered. In other words, self-controlled. Not given to drunkenness. Now, let me just tell you a quick story that helps to illustrate this. Many years ago, I was on a flight from Bali in Indonesia to Perth in Western Australia. And I was sitting next to these two strapping young Australian men, okay? And they really were very Australian. They were wearing vests on the aeroplane, okay? They looked very normal, very Australian. And the hostess came down the aisle on the aeroplane, and she was offering everybody a drink, including the amber nectar. And to my astonishment, both of these strapping Australian lads, they both ordered a Coke. Well, I thought this is most curious, because surely the only thing that Australian men drink is beer. So I said, "What's with the Coke?" And they said, well, mate, it's because we're Christians. We don't drink. I said, you are joking. Not about the drinking thing, but about the fact that there could be Christians in Australia, because everyone knows it's the most godless place on earth, isn't it? How could there be Christians in Australia? But they both fished out a Bible to prove it. And as I got to know them over the coming weeks, I realised they really were. Do you know, Paul he does not say, do not drink. But at that time, in their culture, those two lads, they knew that the godly thing to do at that time in that culture was to abstain completely from alcohol. It was immensely countercultural, and I've got to tell you, it made the profoundest impact on me. It really did. Those guys believed the gospel, and it didn't show itself in hypocrisy, it didn't show itself in legalism, it showed itself in gospel living that really transformed. It started to transform my life. So blameless at home, blameless in character, and then lastly, blameless in doctrine. I'd love you to look at verse 9 with me. Verse 9, at the end of that first reading, Paul says an elder is just another word for a church leader, must hold on literally to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can both encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. You know, to refute is just to tell someone that they are wrong. And you see, the thing is, faulty teaching is attractive because novelty and controversy sell. Holding firm, teaching healthy, life-giving doctrine is not a great way to make a name for yourself, because by definition, it's all been said before. There's nothing new or exotic about sound teaching. And that's why I just love what was said of Jonathan Edwards after he died in 1758. Please remember, we're not talking about Jonathan Edwards, the triple jumper, okay? We're talking about Jonathan Edwards, the New England Puritan. And this is what was said of him after he died. It was the glory of this great man. It was the glory of this great man that he had no love for innovation, for things that were new, for newness' sake. To the scriptures, he yielded the most profound reverence and the most implicit confidence. Do you know, I want to make a plea with you. We live in a culture that absolutely loves giftedness. We live in a church culture that rates giftedness above every other thing. We need to be really careful, because the Bible doesn't. The Bible always puts grace before gifts. And here's the extraordinary thing. I don't know if this has been your experience, it's certainly been mine, but when we are amazingly willing to listen to God's wisdom and do what God says, amazingly, providentially, he gives us everything else as well. When we put grace and godly character at the top, actually the giftedness follows. Grace before gifts. You know, I've spoken about this before, but there's a great book written about the Welsh revival in 1904. It's called Grace, Grit and Gumption. And the title says it all, as this huge Christian revival spread all the way across Wales. What was needed? I'll tell you what was needed. It was men and women of grace. It just means men and women who loved Jesus, who understood the gospel, and whose goal was godliness. And the thing is, you think to yourself, well, surely people who love Jesus and love godliness, they must be a bit pathetic, they must be a bit puny, they must be a bit weak. And yet what was also needed was people of grit. Grit just means character. It means endurance. It means toughness. You see, grace, grit, and then lastly, gumption. Gumption just means common sense, which we lack, don't we? But that's what was needed. Where was the giftedness? The giftedness would flow from the godly character, because it always does. In all of our lives, we need to get things in the right order. Grace before gifts. You know, I'd love you to wake up, you guys. I'd love you to wake up and listen to this, all right? It's grace before godliness and giftedness. Get it right. I heard a great summary of this the other day. What do we need to be? We need to be people who love God. We need to be people who love other people. And we need to be people who love what is good. That's what Paul says down in verse 8, who love what is good. That is the model for Christian life. It is the model for Christian service. And we miss it so often. But that's what we need to be. And we need to encourage it and admire it in each other. But you know, what was going on in Crete was the opposite. A bit like LA Confidential. There was a rottenness, there was a corruption about what was going on in these churches in Crete. We're told it was ruining whole households. What is it? What is this thing that was going on? Well, verse 10. It's got something to do, would you believe, with circumcision. Now, don't switch off, because this is where it gets really interesting. Okay? Right? Just follow me on this. There are false teachers, there are corrupt elders, and their teaching goes something like this. You become a Christian by faith in Christ. Tick. Okay, that's good. But to be a proper Christian, to be a good Christian, you need to do something extra. You need to keep some rules. You need to do more. You need to be circumcised. You should be thinking, how in the world could anybody persuade anybody else that the right thing to do is cut off your foreskin? Sorry to be crude, but we're not children, are we? That's what circumcision was. If I came up to you and I said, what you need to do is cut off your foreskin, what would you do? You'd run a mile, surely. And this was 60 AD. There was no anaesthetic. But you see, that is precisely how legalism works. Please, we need to hear this. Can we come on to the next slide, please? Okay, this is exactly how legalism works. It was the greatest problem of these churches in Crete, and you know what? I find it is still a massive problem here in this building. You see, legalism says you must live this way. You must keep these rules. You must tick these boxes. Now, I'm no teacher, and this is going to be even more controversial than what I just said about cutting off your foreskin, but it seems to me that legalism is a bit like an Ofsted inspection. Yeah. It can give a school a good appearance, but it doesn't really tell you about the teaching. Is that fair? Maybe not. The question with legalism is always, what must I do? Have I done enough? And that's why circumcision is so beautiful. Do you see how it works? If I've done something so painful, so self-denying, so sacrificial that I can't even walk now, it must make me godly. Do you see that? That's how it works. That's why people were doing it. You can touch circumcision. You can certainly feel it. And it must make me godly. And you know what? You and I, we can substitute no end of things for circumcision. Let me go through a few of them. I can give up cake for Lent, and it makes me a godly person. I come to church every week. It makes me a godly person. I run this, I run that. I do this, I do that. It makes me a godly person. I only gossip about people I don't like. It makes me a godly person. But let me show you what is so chilling about legalism. This is so fantastically written. Let me show you what is so chilling about legalism. The very same people in Crete who said, you have got to be circumcised, the very same people who were saying that were evil brutes, liars and gluttons. It's exactly the same people. You see, if I'm circumcised, it means I'm godly, then there's nothing to stop me being a lying, evil brute. If I can say I'm godly because I don't drink and I don't swear, then it doesn't matter that I'm a bully to my wife. If I say it's going to church or being confirmed, there's a good one. Or taking communion. Or even helping out with Denton Community Challenge. If I can lay all my godliness on that one peg, then what I do the rest of the week doesn't matter. Do you know what? Don't hear me wrong. I'd love you to help with Denton Community Challenge, okay? But don't make it the measure of your godliness. If you make one thing the measure of your godliness, do you see what you do? It just limits godliness. Do you see that? It's so important. It's so helpful, this. That's the first problem with legalism. And the second problem is it doesn't work. It has no power to change us. It leads to verse 16. Verse 16 is nasty. This is where legalism leads. Verse 16, they claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. So what's the answer? What is the answer? Well, do you know what? I'm going to finish with this story, okay? It's a story, another story from Richard Pratt, the American guy who was a speaker at Bible by the Beach a couple of weeks ago, and I just think it's a helpful story. I'm going to share it with you. Do you remember he was American? He grew up in a town in Virginia, and he said that he and his friends used to hang around outside the school watching all the people driving into the school car park, okay? And he said that what they used to do was they used to evaluate every single person completely on the basis of the car they drove. Yeah? Does that sound familiar? You don't do that, do you? So basically it went like this. If you drive up in a really rubbish car, then you are a crummy human being. If you drive up in a decent car, then you are worth knowing. One day, a really rough car arrives, a bit like my Vauxhall Zafira. It's about 20 years old. It's got dents all over it. It shakes as it goes along. There are parts missing. And as he arrived, the boy who was driving this horrible car wound down the window. He stuck his hand out and went, "Hi y'all, how you doing?" Because he was Virginian, I think. But the point is this really, he was a new student and he did not know how utterly worthless he was driving that car. Anyway, in this town, there was a 6-lane road, okay, with traffic lights at intervals along the road, okay? A bit difficult for us to imagine, but I was in Essex on Friday night and they actually have them there. And in the evening, you would go out in your car and you would look for someone to race, okay? You'd pull up to the traffic lights and there'd be someone next to you and then you would rev your car as a signal that you wanted to race. And if the person next to you wanted to race, they would back. And you knew you had a race on. And that night, everyone went out looking for this new boy, Scott, so that they could absolutely humiliate him. And that is exactly what happened. Except Scott beat every single person. He won every single race. How in the world could he do that? Well, later that evening, he pulled in, I think it was at the skate park, which is where Virginian youth hang out. He got out of his car, he opened the bonnet, and then they realised why he was not ashamed. Scott was a master mechanic, and he had built that engine from the ground up. He knew something about his car that Richard Pratt and his friends didn't know. It had power under the bonnet. It had power under the bonnet. And the point of that story is it's the same for us. The gospel of grace, and the gospel of grace alone, has power to save people and then to change them. If our godliness is not rooted in gospel grace, then all it will produce is legalism. If our godliness is not rooted in gospel grace, all it will produce is outward conformity. And sometimes that outward conformity will look really impressive. But you know what it will result in our hearts? Decay and rottenness and corruption. You see, grace is not just the beginning of the Christian life. It is the fuel for the Christian life. And no other fuel will work. No other fuel will work. Rules have no power to change hearts. I'm going to finish now, but if this is a helpful way to think about it, I found it very helpful. Legalism always says, you must do this, or you should not do this. The gospel of grace says, you need not. You see the difference? You need not get drunk, because Jesus is a better refuge. You need not be impatient and short-tempered, because God is in control of this situation. You need not look for satisfaction there and here and here, because what does Jesus offer you? Something that's bigger and better. He offers you living water. He offers you true bread that comes from heaven. He offers rest for your souls. You need not look for thrills there and there, Because trust me, if you follow Jesus, he'll give you thrills.